Hello again, everyone. I just wanted to take a few minutes and do a little more follow-up to the most recent discussions, and in particular, talking a little bit about the discussion regarding living wage, and then the discussion around Monsanto. So, starting with that discussion about whether or not we agree with the Catholic social teaching tradition of all workers deserving a living wage, or whether we side more towards saying that whatever is agreed upon in a free market is just. It was pretty clear that the significant majority of people approve of this idea from Catholic social teaching that all workers are entitled to a living wage. There are just a couple of things that I wanted to respond to and maybe clarify a little bit. Right. So one thing to note that came up in some of the discussions was, again, as I think I say in the module, this doesn't necessarily mean that a small business or even any particular business is required to provide everything that's necessary to support each employee. Right. That what we have to accomplish is that as a social system, as a community, that we are meeting all of the workers' needs. Right. So for a part-time student worker in the summer, obviously, it wouldn't be required for a business to provide all of the compensation and support that that person would need to live a dignified life. They're going to be getting a lot of that support from other venues. And the same might be true even for many minimum wage workers, right? That there might be other social systems that would come in to provide some of the needs that might not be provided via their paycheck and benefits. A lot of you commented, and I think pretty much every group, there was discussion about whether or not it was fair for people working in fast food, for example, to make the same as teachers or nurses or other occupations that require a lot of training and background. The idea of a living wage certainly doesn't mean that everybody ought to be paid the same, right? So it's not part of a living wage. And some people seem to think that this meant, well, everyone would be paid the same salary regardless of their skills or training or experience. And that's certainly not the case, right? What this is arguing for is that everyone should make a certain minimum that would allow them to lead a basic, dignified life with shelter, food, clothing, that sort of thing. And so, yes, we certainly would still have and probably should still have different levels of compensation for people with different amounts of skills and training. So this does not mean that somebody working in McDonald's is going to make the same as a nurse or a teacher or a neuro scientist or a surgeon. So I want to make sure we're clear on that. But in general, there seemed to be a lot of agreement with this. I think it's interesting over the years that I've taught this course, there's much less resistance on this topic than there was in the past, which I think might be due in part to a lot more conversation in our country in the past few years about how the benefits of the economy aren't being kind of fairly distributed across the spectrum of workers and CEOs. So I think it's interesting to see how people have become more and more open to this idea of a living wage. So that was the main thing I wanted to make sure I clarified in regard to that discussion. When we go over to Monsanto, again, the vast majority of people thought that Monsanto was acting unfairly, unjustly in regards to its conduct, both in creating and distributing and marketing products which are harmful or at least have a significant risk of being harmful, and then also in their treatment of the small farmers who use their seeds and who are then sometimes accused of violating the terms of their contract with Monsanto. So just a couple of things to mention here, right? First of all is, as many of you probably know or noticed in the discussion, Monsanto is no longer an independent company. They were bought by Bayer, the big pharmaceutical company, which initially made aspirin. And so Monsanto is now a division of this larger corporation. but they continue their operations much the same as they have in the past. And of course, there have recently been a large number of lawsuits, a number of which have been successful against Monsanto around their main agricultural product, the herbicide Roundup, which has been linked with certain kinds of cancer in a number of studies, and then a number of lawsuits have been based on that. And so they are experiencing a lot of pressure, both kind of politically, legally, and economically in recent years. But certainly they're nowhere near losing their dominance in the agricultural market. So there's that little change in terms of what's going on with Monsanto. Another thing I wanted to comment on, which a number of you brought up in your post, was something along the lines of saying, well, I think Monsanto started out with good intentions, but things seem to have gone wrong. And again, I'm not really in a position to judge the initial motivations of the people who founded the corporation or the company, but I think this is a helpful thing to think about in terms of Catholic social teaching. And that is that when we're thinking about issues in Catholic social teaching, we have to look at the effects of systems that we set up and see how they actually play out once they are sort of released into the real world, if you will, right? And so sometimes you can create a product, you can create a business or a new technology with one sort of intention for it, but then when it gets out into the world, you see that it is actually producing different results, right? And so you might, for example, decide to create a very affordable gun for people to use to protect themselves from bears in the Rocky Mountains, right? And it turns out once you release it that it is actually being used overwhelmingly for gang violence, right? That this was not your intention. You had a perfectly innocent, perfectly just intention, but in the effects of this product in the real world have become very problematic and very harmful, right? And so one of the things that Catholic social teaching would say is that we have to look at how those effects really play out and act accordingly. So, right, so we should probably stop producing this. Or a perfect example would be the opioid crisis of recent years. That there's nothing intrinsically wrong with producing a new type of pain reliever and promoting your pain reliever. But if it becomes clear that this pain reliever is in fact being abused, and it becomes clear that it is in fact highly addictive, then you have to change the way that you produce, the way you market this product. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that in fact the drug companies, at least some of them, did the opposite, and in fact made use of its addictive qualities and promoted the drug in a way that increased addictions and problems because they were making a ton of money from it. So that would be the similar kind of example. So if you're Monsanto and you develop these GMO products, you develop these herbicides with a good intention of increasing food supply and affordable food for the world, but if you discover in fact that it is producing health effects, if you discover that it is creating really unjust economic situations in places like India or in other parts of the developing world, then you have to step back and think about ways that maybe you need to change your product, change your systems in a way that will actually promote the real good of your customers and of society, right? So we don't want to say that every time a product or system produces harmful results in the world that we're going to hold the originators or the company responsible as if they intended to do that, because sometimes we don't know how products will function in the real world. But once it becomes clear that there are problems on a social level from a particular product, from a particular technology, then we do have an obligation, even if our original intentions were different, to go back and modify that system, modify that product or that technology in light of the results it's producing in the real world. And I think that's something we could clearly say that Monsanto has not really done in regard to a number of the different problems that their products seem to be creating in the world around us. So anyways, thank you again for all of your discussions. You all did a good job on those two discussions, and I If you have any questions or want to discuss this further, please feel free to respond. Otherwise, I'll plan on seeing you in the next discussion.